Okay, let's go. Welcome, fellow creatures of the night, to the first meeting of the Midnight Culture Club. Here we venture deep into the nocturnal lands of the strange, the morbid, the absurd and the obscure, in film, books, TV, fairy tales, urban legends, and many other forms of pop culture. We discuss and analyse these texts to explore the fascinating ways they reflect, comment on, and critique the world we live in from its darker side. I am Xenia, the over-motivated nerd who never lets any other members get a word in, and I declare this first meeting of the Midnight Culture Club officially in session. So, as you've just heard, you're listening to the very first episode of Midnight Culture Club, and I want to thank all 4.5 of you for attending, aka listening to this podcast, out of the hundreds of thousands of podcasts you could have listened to instead. It really means a lot to me that anyone at all is giving this little project a chance. In this first episode, we'll be talking about not one, but two pop culture classics, the original science fiction novel Frankenstein, and one of its most unhinged adaptations, the cult classic musical film, The Rocky Horror Picture Show. But before that, I'd like to introduce myself and the idea of this podcast a little bit. So, since I can remember, I've always loved stories and the words and images that so powerfully convey them. When I was in kindergarten, I eagerly taught myself to read so I could drink in all the enticing stories, the new worlds that called to me from the pages of books. And the stories that I gradually realised drew me in the most were those that made other kids and their parents ask if I didn't get nightmares from them. Mostly because there were a lot of vampires in them. Loved vampires as a child. So I didn't have any nightmares. Very few. Well, but these stories truly fueled my imagination and made me start writing myself. Quite a bit later on at uni, I had the great luck to be able to make this fascination my main thing. I studied English literature, linguistics, and popular culture studies, and I actually just graduated with my master's. So you've got a real expert here. Or something like that. I've diversified a bit since the exclusive vampire era when it comes to the content of the stories I love to read and watch and dissect, but my favourites are still unusual and sometimes dark stories, horror and mystery, the weird, the quirky, the absurd, and sometimes the disturbingly real, from haunting gothic classics like the original Frankenstein novel to shrill and camp cult icons like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is one of my absolute favourite films of all time, so we had to start with it. Simply anything that goes a little under the radar of the prim and proper or sets off all its alarms. These stories are fascinating to me because they tell us so much, not only about the fears and dreams that we hold, but also about the power structures and the systemic issues that shape our world. These kinds of stories allow the topics and the individuals that are usually pushed to the margins into dark obscurity to be seen and discussed. And by looking closely and carefully at the people and the topics normative society excludes, denies, or fears, but is all the same fascinated by, we can learn infinitely more about our world than if we ignore them. And this is exactly what I want to do in this podcast. It would be wonderful if you guys would join me on this venture onto the nocturnal side of culture that is populated by glittering outcasts and furious girls, by killers and aliens and queer vampires that are all rooting for more than the humans that they snack on. I'd truly love to have you here. And now it's finally time to get started, to dig up some dead bodies, get out our top secret scientific equipment, and strap on the glittering plateau heels for our first meeting. Frankenstein, but make it sexy. Or why the Rocky Horror Picture Show is a more accurate adaptation of the Frankenstein material than you'd think. So I'm sure all of you have heard the name Frankenstein before. It's almost impossible not to stumble upon it at some point. If you belong to the vast majority of people, When you think of Frankenstein and Frankenstein's creature, you probably picture a mad scientist professor toiling away in a spooky castle during a storm to build a person from scratch. Perhaps he's aided by a hunchbacked assistant named Igor. Eventually, with much strain, the use of strange instruments, flashes of lightning, and excited screams of "It's alive!" the mad scientist brings to life a gigantic, greenish, mute creature, perhaps with a dramatic scar across his forehead, who then brutally bumbles around and kills lots of people. Interestingly, this very persistent, popular perception of the Frankenstein tale has little in common with Mary Shelley's novel that started the whole Frankenstein craze while casually inventing the sci-fi genre when the author was only 18 years old, making literally everybody else look like an underachieving loser. Well done, Mary. Shelley's Victor Frankenstein does not once set foot in a castle, and rather than being a professor, his academic rank is no higher than that of over-motivated chemistry student. There is no sign of an Igor or any other kind of assistant, and instead of excitedly calling out, Victor responds to his bringing the creature to life by bravely running away to hide in his bedroom because the creature is too ugly for his poor little eyes to behold. And that reaction is the root of all the tragedy that is to follow, but more on that later. So if the original Frankenstein novel doesn't contain these typical Frankenstein elements, where do they come from? Well, they mostly hail from early adaptations of the story to the stage. According to an article by Douglas William Hoon, I'm going to say it in like a very German way, because I don't know how else to say that last name, Hoon, which most of the information in this section comes from, and that you can find linked in the sources. Like all the sources, they're all listed there. Well, according to this article, Frankenstein was very quickly and enthusiastically adapted for the stage. This was likely because the story really hit the zeitgeist of 1820s Britain, a time and place where scientific innovation and the rapidly proceeding industrialization called the established roles of humans, their natural environment, and religion into question. Suddenly, things that had long been assumed to be God's perfect, ineffable design could be examined and explained through sciences like physics, biology, medicine, and chemistry. Crucially for Frankenstein, the electricity present in nature, such as in lightning bolts and electric impulses in the body, became the subject of intense study and experiment, as well as entertainment. For example, an Italian guy called Galvani famously succeeded in making the legs of dead frogs twitch by using electricity. We know, and this is from Mary Shelley's foreword of the revised edition of Frankenstein, that these experiments about electricity and the body influenced Mary when she wrote her novel. Now, all of these scientific developments and discoveries led to excitement and a sense of progress, but also to great anxieties. What had seemed like fact was being deconstructed, and nobody could tell what humankind might be capable of with all of this knowledge. Now, all of these scientific developments and discoveries led to excitement and a sense of progress, but also to great anxieties. What had seemed like fact was being deconstructed, and nobody could tell what humankind might be capable of with all of this new knowledge. Both of these thoughts were understandably unsettling. At the same time, the Romantic movement, which is the literary movement that we get the Gothic genre from, so all the castles and ghosts and people walled in, feared a disenchantment of the world and pleaded that a sense of mystery and spirituality should be retained in the face of this rapid scientific rationalization. It's not surprising, as the Hoon article points out, that in this cultural landscape, Frankenstein, a story that deals with the artificial creation of life through scientific means, harnessed by an ordinary human being, dropped like a bomb, or perhaps more fittingly, struck like lightning. And this is how, just a few years after the publication of Shelley's novel in 1818, the Frankenstein story was already performed on English stages. The first and seemingly most influential of these stage adaptations was called Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein. It was a melodrama written by a popular playwright called Richard Brinsley Peake and performed in many respectable theatres across London. And it is Dickie Peake's highly successful play that we can trace much of the popular Frankenstein image back to. Again, we're going to look at a musical version of the Frankenstein material later on. It's interesting to see that Presumption included several songs composed specifically for the play, so it was essentially already a musical. Peake also added a few more romantic couples to the play, so not everybody would be dead at the end, and he created a comedic character of a servant to Victor Frankenstein, a nervously pacing guy called Fritz, the origin of the infamous Igor. I understand why they changed the name to Igor later, because Fritz is not a great name for a spooky assistant, isn't it? And not to miss out on another key element of the Frankenstein starter pack, Presumption also has Victor excitedly yell, "It lives!" when his creature comes to life. But the most crucial change that Peake made from Shelley's Frankenstein is that the creature does not speak. It is this change, in my opinion, that creates the foundation for the creature to become dehumanized, expendable, and, as he is in many later adaptations, the villain of the piece. This was not yet the case in Peake's play, though, where the creature, as in Shelley's novel, combines gentleness and compassion with moments of ruthless revenge and horrific violence. And in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, you will see the creature's muteness play out in yet another way. Foreshadowing. But now we come to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because I've rambled a little bit about what Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and his creature are not, so it's time to talk about what they are. Shelley's Victor Frankenstein is a wealthy young man from the area surrounding Lake Geneva in Switzerland who leaves home to study at a German university in Ingolstadt. There, he becomes obsessed with the idea of creating life artificially. He locks himself in his dorm room laboratory, which he has for some reason, and he works out how to build a human being from recycled bits of old human being, except at night when he goes to snatch said bits of old human being from the local graveyard. Obviously, you can't do that in broad daylight, since it might be a little awkward if somebody saw you carrying a random dead leg down the street. But anyway, Victor works tirelessly on his project, probably procrastinating writing his term paper, and it is here that the text shows us something important about Victor's character. When he realizes that his plan of creating a human might actually work, a sense of grandiose self-importance breaks through and begins to guide his actions. At this point, Victor says this: "Life and death appear to me ideal bounds, which I first should break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs." In this quote, Victor presents himself as an almost godlike feature whose work will single-handedly enlighten the world and who is owed endless gratitude by this new species he plans to create. This idea of Victor's self-image as a divine creator is very interesting because it links to the book's subtitle, The Modern Prometheus. Prometheus is, in Greek mythology, the deity who creates humankind. So if you're looking for someone to blame for everything that's going wrong, he's a good choice. As usual with mythology, there are different versions of the Prometheus story, but the essence of all of them is this. Prometheus, a titan, so one of the old order of the gods, climbs down to earth and shapes figures from clay from the body of Mother Earth, Gaia. He gets Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, to breathe life into them, and thus humanity is born. Big boss of the gods, Zeus, ever charming and definitely not insecure, instantly freaks out and worries that the humans may become a danger to the gods. Hoping that this will keep them manageable, he forbids them the use of fire. But Prometheus loves his creation and ignores Zeus to bring them the gift of fire. As punishment for this disobedience to the rules made by his own kind, Prometheus is tied to a rock, and every day an eagle is sent to devour his liver. At night his liver grows back, and so his torment begins again come sunrise. Like Prometheus, Victor makes himself the master over life and death, takes a position that in his time and place is reserved for deities. And in doing this, he disobeys the rules of nature and society and is horribly punished for it. It is classic hubris, the pride that comes before the fall. Except Victor is not punished by another god, but by his own creation. When he finally succeeds on a stormy November night to bring his creature to life, there is no mention of lightning playing a role in this awakening, by the way, Victor is terrified. The creature is not what he expected, not the beautiful man he tried to build, but, a patchwork of reanimated body parts that don't look very pleasant. Victor doesn't try to sort out the mess he believes he has made. Of course not, that's what a reasonable person would do. Instead, he runs away, hides in his bedroom, falls asleep, wakes up, and walks around the city for hours. When he returns, the creature is gone, and Victor thinks, great, problem solved, nothing to worry about, like an idiot. Now, you might say this is early on in the text. Perhaps Victor will realize that his hubris and the unwillingness to take responsibility for his creation are not a good idea. Perhaps he will grow, become wiser and more modest as the book continues. But no, he just becomes whiny, self-centered dramatic as well as grandiose, self-centered dramatic. In fact, we could say that Victor Frankenstein is the whiniest little bitch to ever whinily bitch on God's green earth, and he only gets worse with time. That is a scientific fact no sources needed. Exhibit A. For the next several months, Victor becomes extremely ill and almost dies, all because he had to look at the consequences of his own actions for 2 minutes. After his recovery, he studies literature for a bit before returning home to get married to his adopted sister, Elizabeth, which is not incestuous at all. When Victor returns home, he is met with the horrible news that his little brother William was murdered, and that a servant of the Frankenstein family, Justine, is being put on trial for the murder. Victor, for once rightly so, suspects the creature of having killed the child. And here comes Exhibit B. While Justine's trial is ongoing, Victor runs out of the courthouse, quote, in agony, and proclaims that the tortures of the accused did not equal mine. Because, of course, even though Justine has to fear and indeed ends up being sentenced to death, despite being innocent, Victor is the real victim here and suffers much more than anybody else could ever suffer. And crucially at this point, Victor's attitude towards the creature changes. When at first he simply feared the creature, he now begins to hate him with all his might. After all, this terrible monster, as evil as it is ugly, has in its violent, unhuman rage killed an innocent little child, cruelly caused the death of a woman, and in turn deserves to be destroyed. Right? It is at this point in the story that both Victor and the reader are confronted with the creature's narrative for the first time. The creature guides Victor to his hiding place high up in the mountains, the only place where he feels safe, and explains how his life has unfolded since the moment his creator abandoned him on the night of his birth. And his life since has been an endless series of ostracism and cruel rejection. Left to his own devices, the creature found a way through forests and villages where he was always physically beaten out of the community the second people laid eyes on him. A man even shot at him after he saved a girl from drowning, because he thought he had tried to kill the girl, because he looks like a bunch of sewn together body parts. It becomes obvious quickly, even to the local idiot Victor, that the creature isn't a mindless brute at all. He is sensitive and educated, has taught himself to understand language, to speak, to read. And more than anything, he is hurt and alone after having been violently rejected by every single human being he's ever met. In the creature's speech that spans around 40 pages, he drops the most metal lines in the whole book. Ahem. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Here we see a couple of things. First of all, there's religious imagery in this sequence. It specifically refers to Paradise Lost, which we later find out the creature has read, so he's very educated. He's like literally reading Milton. He specifically highlights the difference between God's glorious creation of Adam, the first of humanity that he's proud of, and who only falls because of bad women. Otherwise, he would have been perfect, obviously. And the difference between Adam and Satan. And according to the creature, this difference only lies in the experiences that these figures make, the way they are treated by their creator and by others. So the reason why the creature is not Adam, but Satan, the fallen angel who rebels against God, against his creator, is simply because he was treated with hate himself. And I think here Mary Shelley is way ahead of her time, able to highlight that the way people are treated might play much more of a role than their sort of genetic makeup. Most importantly, this quote emphasizes the conflict at the heart of Frankenstein, the question of humanity, because the creature can pinpoint very clearly that his descent into revenge and violence, into what we may call monstrous behavior because it hurts the rules of society as well as people in a very real physical way, comes from a very human feeling. A feeling that many people will be able to sympathize with in a way that many have probably felt themselves. The feeling of rejection and loneliness, the wish, the need to feel affection, to be part of a community, to feel like you matter to someone. The creature is not the inhuman cartoon villain he has often been made into in later adaptations, and that, to some degree, Victor makes him look. He becomes a villain over the course of the story, yes, but he's very human in his villainy. The tragedy of it is that the people around him cannot, or perhaps refuse to, see past his exterior and fail to realize that he is not so different from them. But the text itself that lets the reader encounter the creature from within, because we can read his words directly, is a lot more compassionate than the world within the novel. What I also want to emphasize is the way that the creature argues for his right to speak, his right to give his side of the story to Victor. He says, "The guilty are allowed, by human laws, bloody as they are, to speak in their own defense before they are condemned. Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature. Oh, praise the eternal justice of man." Although it's certainly very relevant, the plea for being allowed to make a defense isn't the only thing about this quote that's interesting. What's also important is that the creature brings up an inherent imbalance between him, who was initially created to be a human being, and naturally occurring human beings, in the understanding of Victor who has made him. Even though Victor once dreamed of being the father of a wonderful species, he views this species as lesser than his own. And the creature is right. Victor does consider it acceptable for him to destroy his own creations, as we shall see later on. So this discrepancy between the value of, so to speak, natural human life and artificial human life, and the creator's belief that he has the right to kill his own creation when it, in the widest sense of the word, misbehaves, seems to be a point of conflict here, and it is one that you should remember because it will crop up again later. I just want to throw in here, it's also an interesting point when we look at some series like sci-fi novels now that talk about artificial intelligence that has become sentient, and this idea of whether the the lives of sentient AIs are worth the same as sort of natural human life crops up as well. And I think that's an interesting connection to a very current issue that we see talked about a lot. So yeah, it's just an interesting parallel to something very recent, and kind of shows that this topic still has a lot of relevance. As the creature's narrative progresses, the creature admits to having killed Victor's little brother, somewhat by accident, to essentially keep him from shouting. He also tells Victor that he framed Justine for the killing by putting a piece of the boy's jewellery in her pocket because he was frustrated that he would never experience the affection of a human woman like her. See, I think the creature makes many very important points in his speech, and overall, if you haven't noticed yet, I have to say I'm team creature, but he is very much using incel logic here, which is not cool. Like, it's not fair to frame someone for murder because they wouldn't want to date you or be nice to you. Not cool, creature. Very dodgy, very sneaky. Not good. But the creature's main issue stands. He is hurt by the constant rejection and ensuing loneliness that defines his entire existence. And it is for this reason that he becomes bitter. This is why he came to find Victor in the first place. Because at the end of this story, the creature directs one request at his maker, and it is a markedly human request. He asks Victor to build him a partner, a companion, one just like him, but female, because he has learned that no human being would ever love him, and he cannot stand to be alone. Victor, after being a dick to the creature for a bit, discovers the feeling compassion and agrees to build a companion for the creature. He specifically travels to the UK to do so away from his family, but he brings his best mate, Henri Clerval or Henry Clerval, depending if you want to be French or not. On a tiny island off the Scottish coast, Victor begins working on creature number 2, but he increasingly regrets this decision as time progresses. He fears that the creature and the creaturess might have lots of frightful creature babies that will wreak havoc on the world. Instead of simply not giving her a uterus, which would have elegantly solved that problem, Victor destroys the creaturess. Naturally, the creature number 1, is not happy about this. He appears dramatically during a storm like a legend and curses Victor, promising to take revenge and dropping another of his 10 out of 10 lines when he threatens, "I shall be with you on your wedding night." And he will be. But first, the creature does another round of murdering someone close to Victor, in this case Henry, and framing somebody for the murder, in this case Victor. So Victor is in remand in Ireland for a bit, gets sick for months, as he always does, and once he is no longer sick, he becomes increasingly depressed. Fun times for everyone. And when said prophesized wedding night arrives, Victor and Elizabeth, his adopted sister, become newlywed wife, stay at a cute little hotel by the lake in Switzerland again, in Geneva. Victor runs away to look for the creature. My introduction to textual analysis instructor, first year of uni, said Victor actually runs away because he is afraid of sleeping with Elizabeth because he can't deal with the real people and is always hiding from them, which I find a convincing reading. However, unfortunately, because Victor runs away, he makes a tragic error of judgment, because while he sneaks around the back of the hotel to sniff out and confront his child that's gone off the rails, said child sneaks inside the hotel and strangles Elizabeth. After this, Victor goes on his own vengeful rampage. He follows the creature to the ends of the earth as he collects little clues the creature leaves him in a morbid scavenger hunt. This scavenger hunt ends after many months on an exploration ship frozen solid in the Arctic ice. Funny how the dangers of crossing nature's boundaries and venturing too far into the extreme and the unknown are reflected in this failed expedition. On this ship, after a further illness that he attributes to the strenuous chase after the creature, Victor dies without ever fulfilling his revenge plan. But it turns out he doesn't need to, since the creature appears and vows, now that Victor is gone and there is no more point to his own existence, to take his own life before he disappears into the vast icy deserts of the Arctic, never to be seen again. And so creator and creature leave the world, not quite together, but slowly crushed by their forever escalating conflict that brought doom on both of them, and that neither was ever going to escape alive. Victor, in overstepping the boundaries of nature and, guided by hubris, making himself master over life and death, is punished for his grandiose ambitions. And perhaps even more importantly, he is punished for his unwillingness to take responsibility for his creation. A creation that, before it came into being, Victor saw as his child, but that he then discarded as an inhuman monster before ever giving him a chance. This thought I'd like you to hold on to until the end of this episode. And now I am sure you're all thinking, okay, this pride before the fall thing and the murder and the misery are all well and good, but how cool would it be if Victor was an alien, he and the creature hooked up, and then everyone performed some bangers? Well, I've got you covered, because fortunately, you're not the first person to think that. A gentleman called Richard O'Brien, who definitely wasn't on LSD, already had this brilliant idea in the 1970s and wrote the glorious musical The Rocky Horror Show, which was then made into the equally glorious film The Rocky Horror Picture Show. The film initially flopped hard in cinemas, then became a cult classic known for its legendary interactive midnight showings that united queer people, students, and weirdos in cinemas across the world, but especially in the US. And the rest, as we say, is history. Ready? Let's go. The Rocky Horror Picture Show begins by introducing our two main characters, who aren't really the main characters. A young couple from Denton, Ohio, called Janet and Brad, normal, ordinary, healthy kids, as the narrator describes them. Yes, there is a narrator. He's an old man in a fancy office in a suit and he has sick dance moves. Yes. Janet and Brad get engaged at the beginning of the film. Now, while the Rocky Horror Picture Show was made in the 70s, Janet and Brad are very 1950s and conservative 1950s, not rock and roll Elvis the Pelvis 1950s. Although Janet is allowed to wear a miniskirt, which is truly scandalous. She is played by Susan Sarandon, so she is gorgeous. Brad is played by a guy called Barry, who looks like a serial killer of the anxious nerdy variety. Or maybe he's just a boring man from the 70s. The look is practically identical. So Janet and Brad, like all normal people after they get engaged, go on a little road trip to visit their former science teacher whose class they met in. On the way there, Nixon's resignation speech plays on the radio, but nobody's listening to his affirmation that America's under threat. Miss Janet and Bestie Brett get a bit lost, and their car has a punctured tire, so they have to stop and get help. Fortunately, there is a conveniently located spooky mystery castle just around the corner, complete with thunder and lightning, a hunchbacked servant called Riff Raff, not Igor, but he is Igor, and all that good horror movie Frankenstein imagery. And this is where we shall meet our glorious creator and his creature. In the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Frankenstein is upgraded to Dr. Frank N Furter, having earned both a PhD and a fun little phallic pun to his name. Frank is easily the screen version of Victor Frankenstein that is most accurate to the book, since he, like Victor, keeps running away from responsibility, blames everyone except himself for his mistakes, and is overall a massive self-centered drama queen. However, Frank is considerably cooler while being a massive, self-centered drama queen. Firstly, he is Tim Curry, so instantly iconic. Secondly, he struts around in fishnets, a glittering corset, plateau sandals with stars on their heels, and a pearl necklace that would make the wealthiest wife in the country club hide her jewellery in shame. His singing voice is a gift from the gods, and his accent, allegedly, a mix between Queen Liz II and Tim Curry's own mum. I've also seen a documentary once, whose name I unfortunately can't remember, where it was said that the character is inspired by Lou Reed, who was an icon of protopunk and glam rock and the gender-bending stuff associated with these genres, but take that with a grain of salt because I can't give you a proper source for that. I just found it somewhere in my brain. Fittingly, however, our boy Frank is also very, very horny and has sex with pretty much everyone in the film. Unfortunately, the consent situation is a bit murky there. We will be talking about that in a bit because it's relevant to the portrayal of the creature. Most importantly, however, Frank is better at building people than Victor. A lot better. Not only has he made two functioning little creatures and even given them names, Eddie and Rocky, but they don't look like reanimated corpses that make everyone who lays eyes on them fly in fear. Okay, Eddie has the classic Frankenstein's monster scar and a slightly unhealthy complexion, but he's also just come out of the freezer. But apart from that, these two boys, made from recycled body parts, don't look like they were made from recycled body parts. I'm assuming Frank's superior person-making skills result from the combination of cool alien tech and the fact that people who do drag are generally superhumanly talented in a range of art forms, so why not at building people? But I'm getting ahead of myself a bit. Janet and Brad arrive at the castle and are invited in to a party that is going on that Riff Raff describes as one of the master's affairs. He says it like that. Exactly like that. I'm such a good actor. This specific affair, as the two normal healthy kids are to discover, centers around a magnificent scientific success Frank has achieved. He has built himself a boy. And this is the night to that, as he announces to his guests, his beautiful creature is destined to be born. More excellent acting on my part. Tim Curry can go home. And born the creature is, in a camp montage of colourful flashes and sci-fi vroom vroom noises, from which he emerges tied in bandages like a little cartoon mummy. Frank's two assistants/servants, Columbia and Magenta, remove the bandages to reveal a tan blonde young man dressed in tiny golden shorts, whom Frank names Rocky, and, in stark contrast to Victor when meeting his creature, immediately fawns over. From the very beginning, Rocky's body is focused on a lot. Frank instantly draws attention to it as he gifts him workout equipment and points out how muscular he is throughout the musical number that follows Rocky's animation. The lyrics revolve around Rocky becoming stronger and more masculine under Frank's supervision and a high-protein diet. Don't forget the high-protein diet. 5 dozen eggs every day, like Gaston. Frank keeps touching Rocky, runs after him, when Rocky, visibly scared because he has no idea what's going on, tries to get away from him. Meanwhile, everyone else in the room curiously examines the newly born creation and many seem happy about what they see. The idea of the creature being not terrifying and repulsive to the human eye, but rather very physically attractive might appear a bit strange, like a complete turnaround on the character. It may put you in mind of things like monster romance fiction or a general modern, more open approach to sexuality, but really the roots of this attractiveness of the creature go back to our old acquaintance Dickie Peak and his play Presumption. Yeah, he's making a comeback. Because in this first play adaptation, we can already find a strong emphasis on the creature's body, specifically on the body of the actor who portrayed him. The Hoon article describes that apparently the actor was scantily clad in order to emphasize his tall and muscular physique and the strength associated with these features. So in this first visual adaptation, the creature's body was already absolutely crucial, and it drew a lot of attention. In contemporary reviews of the play, the actor's impressive physique is praised as suitably spectacular. And as suggested by a heckler's call that his wife should not see this kind of body in such a state of undress, seems to have been perceived, at least by this guy, as a little too attractive for respectable ladies to look at. So perhaps the idea of making Frankenstein's creature sexy is not a new one at all. Generally, I believe that as soon as a character's body is visually foregrounded, there will be a certain tendency by parts of the audience to inscribe something erotic into the character. That happens almost every time someone's physicality is so important to the character. And with the creature's body and its creation being at the center of the Frankenstein plot, it makes sense that this eroticization was going to happen sooner or later. What is remarkable about the Rocky Horror Picture Show's sexualized portrayal of the creature is, however, that it doesn't come from the audience, as it very often does, but that Frank has purposefully designed Rocky to perfectly fit his ideal of beauty and attractiveness, and to serve as a manifestation of his sexual desires. At the end of Rocky's introductory scene, Frank leads him into a lavish bedroom with a stained glass window and a large bed while the bridal march plays, making it very clear that the two are going to have sex, that they are about to consummate a kind of marriage. Rocky does not have much of a choice in this. He is built without having any control over the process or over what happens to him after he's successfully animated. So essentially, Frank builds Rocky as a living sex doll. And it is not only Frank who treats Rocky as a sex object. His guests that Frank presents Rocky to touch him and stare at him without any reservations or concern about how it'd make him feel. On top of this, Rocky can't speak except when he is singing, and then he knows mythology references and everything. It's a little wild. So it would be difficult for him to express his discomfort or any other feelings in detail, which tips the portrayal even more into an objectifying direction. And here we come to the dubious consent situation. This is a section of this episode where I talk about this topic, as well as power imbalance in regards to sexual acts in a non-graphic way. You can skip forward about 2 minutes if this is something that you'd prefer not to listen to. The fact that Frank built someone exactly according to his ideals of sexual beauty, who at the same time is a blank slate with no prior experiences of anything, is indicative of a massive power imbalance between the two that Frank takes advantage of. He is not only putting himself in a powerful position of creator, as Victor does, but he exploits this powerful position and Rocky's lack of experience to essentially do with him however he pleases. It is very reminiscent of sort of grooming strategies where adults manipulate children or teenagers for example, sexual purposes. It can be other purposes as well, but in this case, it would be sexual purposes. It is certainly questionable whether Rocky, who knows nothing of sexuality, who can't speak, who can't ask anybody else about this, and who, according to Frank himself, only has half a brain, whether someone in his position can consent, especially in this constellation where the other person is the creator who made him. Rocky's sexuality also remains passive in that he is not the initiator of any sexual interaction, and despite looking rather happy when Frank leads him into the bridal chamber, Rocky is later seen chained up in the same room, implying that he might not be staying there out of his own free will. There is also a scene later in the film where Rocky and Janet have sex after she comes onto him very strongly. He responds to her advances in a sort of childlike, excited fashion. And while the excited part is certainly a good sign, the childlike is not. Frank is very angry about them having sex with each other when he finds out, by the way. He insults them both and threatens to kill Rocky. He states that since he has made Rocky, he can also destroy him again. And as we'll see in a second, he does not seem to have any scruples about doing such a thing. Plus, this shows some very possessive and controlling qualities from Frank's side, in addition to the power imbalance that's already there. The element of dubious sexual consent in the Rocky Horror Picture Show really brings out the questionable power dynamic between creator and creation, especially when the creation lacks the experience and knowledge that the creator already has simply from having existed in the world for many years beforehand. The creation at this point is rather like a child who cannot judge the situations they find themselves in. Like the creature in Frankenstein, who is left to fend for himself without any support, Victor is vulnerable to the people around him, although in a very different way. And this is the bit where you can come back to if you wanted to skip the consent stuff. Okay. During the scene where Rocky is brought to life and presented to the admiring audience, a second storyline comes into play. While Frank chases Rocky around the room, a freezer is accidentally opened, and Frank's first try at making a human, Eddie, emerges. Now, it is a little unclear what exactly Frank did with Eddie because we later find out that he has relatives, so he can't have been newly built by Frank, but there has definitely been some sort of experimenting done on him, as we can tell from the scar on his forehead and the fact that he was put in the freezer so he'd be quiet. We also find out later that Frank split the brain between Eddie and Rocky, but where exactly that brain originally came from is not entirely clear. Frank is not happy about Eddie's appearance. In fact, he is so not happy about it that he pulls out an axe and chops Eddie down. Oopsie. Later on, they serve Eddie up for dinner. Insanely enough, that's not even a major plot point. You know, just a bit of light cannibalism on the side, no big deal, whatever. I think it just shows how unhinged and shrill and weird this film is. In addition to this, there is a whole plotline in the film about Frank seducing both Janet and Brad separately, and this causing some strife between the two, plus Eddie's uncle. Again, no idea why Eddie has an uncle when he is a creature, but the world of Rocky Horror is not a logical one. This uncle is also Janet's and Brad's science teacher, and he shows up and reveals that Frank and his pals are actually aliens. That's not super relevant for the topic of this episode, but it sure is wild. What is important, however, is that the Rocky Horror Picture Show plays with a motif of hubris, and the scientist who plays God by artificially creating life. We actually see this visually represented in a swimming pool in the castle that has the painting of God and Adam from the Sistine Chapel painted on its ground. We see this in a high-angle shot while Frank, Rocky, Janet, Brad and Columbia are all in the water in a little late-night orgy. The juxtaposition of this image of God the Creator and his creations with the leveling situation of the orgy where everyone is sort of on the same plane is an interesting one, especially because it comes only very briefly before the downfall of Frank. After the orgy, Riff Raff and Magenta appear to tell Frank that they plan to return to their home planet. Frank is touched by this and performs a ballad before an imaginary audience dressed in lavish gowns. In this ballad, he sings about wishing to return home after having yearned to see the world, having seen it, and having suffered greatly in the process. He sings of pain and wanting to see blue skies again as the makeup runs off his face, and when he opens his eyes at the end of the song, the audience, like his dream of greatness, has disappeared. It seems that Frank, even on his home planet, was a bit of an outcast who never really fit in anywhere. He is vulnerable for the first time in the film. And sadly, he will not see his home planet again. As opposed to Shelley's Frankenstein, creator and creature don't gradually wear each other down in a prolonged process of mutual destruction. Instead, both Frank and Rocky are struck down by Riff Raff with a laser gun after Frank finishes his heartfelt song. Riff Raff gives a clear reason for killing Frank when he says that his mission is a failure, his lifestyle too extreme. Combined with the knowledge that Frank left his home planet in order to see more of the world, to escape the confines of society he stems from, this suggests that he is killed as a direct punishment for transgressing the rules, as they are perceived by a member of his own native background. It is not fate or the long-term consequences of his actions that kill him as in Frankenstein, but convention. This is a very important difference because it allows for a little more compassion for the creator. He is by no means a good person, but his death seems somewhat unrightful and not like the logical and natural conclusion of the story. Rocky is visibly upset after Frank is killed. He picks up Frank's body and climbs up a prop tower like King Kong. Literally, the King Kong references are strong with this one. And then Riff Raff shoots him down as well in his rage against Frank and his extravagant transgressiveness. Rocky is punished for his creator's crimes. He himself, throughout the film, remains innocent. He never hurts anybody, he certainly never kills anybody. He is the only one, except, and it hurts me to say it, Brad, who also doesn't really do anything wrong. They're the only ones without any sort of blame or moral failings. In a more serious text, I might say Rocky could be the hero. And this compassion for him, this portrayal of the artificial creation that is so often painted as evil simply because he is not human, indicates that the Rocky Horror Picture Show understands its source text very, very well. In fact, this is underscored by the last moments of the film. After the aliens leave Earth, Janet, Brad, and Dr. Scott, the science teacher / Eddie's uncle, are left behind on smoking Earth, and the narrator says, "And crawling on the planet's face, some insects called the human race, lost in time, lost in space, and meaning." After these words, he turns off the light, and we are left with the sombre image of a faintly lit globe surrounded by darkness, all alone. These final images portray humanity's belief in its own exceptionality, in its superiority as a delusion. We are small and forgettable, insects in vast space. And this is the point I really want to extract from both Frankenstein and the Rocky Horror Picture Show at the end of this episode. The way in which both texts emphasize and call into question the creators and their fellow humans / aliens' belief in their own grandeur, especially the resulting idea that they have the right to marginalize and hold power over other life forms or people who are different to them, embodied by the artificially made creations, is critically highlighted. Crisis and conflict always arise at the moment when the creature does not fulfill the creator's expectations and begin to evade their control. In Frankenstein, this happens instantly as Victor is disappointed by the creature's appearance and rejects him because of this. Then, when the creature starts to take charge of his own life, asking for a companion, Victor feels seriously threatened because he fears that the creature and his companion could procreate. It is at this point of a certain social and sexual emancipation, the creature asking to enter a marriage-like partnership, that Victor truly loses control and turns his aggression towards the creature's prospective partner. He destroys the creaturess. Frank does something very similar when Rocky tries to emancipate and pairs up with Janet based on not only sexual desire, but also certain affection and care that he shows him when dressing his wounds, which happens before they hook up. Frank is not happy and also directs aggression both towards the creature and Janet. The two creatures' environments respond to them in ways that at first glance appear to be polar opposites though. Victor's creature is seen as a threat and met with revulsion, hatred, and outright violence. There is the instant assumption that he intends to harm whoever he comes in contact with, even if he helps them, or simply wants to build a friendship with them. Rocky, on the other hand, is admired for his physical beauty, which instills feeling of desire or envy in most of the people he gets presented to that stare at him and touch him with no reservations. As different as these two responses of repulsion versus attraction seem, there is a crucial element that they have in common. Both the creature and Rocky are not treated as equals by the humans or aliens they encounter. Instead, these people put the creations in a category different to themselves that they don't have to respect in the same way they do their own kind. They other the creations, and they do it by using two very typical strategies of othering: marking the other as savage, uncivilized and threatening, or as exotic and sexually objectified. Now, othering is a concept we will definitely be speaking about more in this podcast because it plays a huge role in the horror genre, in everything to do with monsters and the lines we draw between the human and the inhuman, between good and evil. For now, I'll give you a brief summary that is based on the legendary Toni Morrison's definition of othering. Her essays on this topic and the book Playing in the Dark are amazing, and I would highly recommend reading them for yourself if you're interested in this. So, othering, according to Toni Morrison, is the process in which a normative collective identity is constructed through reanalyzing marginalized populations as a contrasting other to the normative society. This means that a group that holds power in a given society essentially picks or even creates a group that is in some way, ideally visually, different from them, and assigns negative qualities to them so that in contrast they can appear in the right to hold power over this other group. The classic example of this is racism, where, let's say in a US context, because that is what Morrison writes about primarily, the white settlers from Europe defined black people and indigenous people as other in order to solidify their own identity and to justify that they oppressed these people, enslave them, put them in reservations, take away their land, that kind of thing. And as we can see, this continues to structure society to this day, so it is something very pervasive that is very difficult to get rid of. Morrison goes on to describe different shapes othering can take, especially in literature, such as not allowing members of the othered population an individual identity when portraying them, including giving them a name, or not letting them speak for themselves. And two of the ways that she describes are precisely the ones we see in Frankenstein and the Rocky Horror Picture Show, respectively. The creature in Frankenstein is, as I already mentioned, perceived by the people he encounters as a threat, as savage and brutish and violent. This misreading of him, because as readers we know it is a misreading, vilifies him in an animalistic, predatory way. Again, it emphasizes the savage, the uncivilized, and I think we can all imagine where this is going in the context of othering, because it is the classic excuse of the colonizer who considers themselves civilized and the other uncivilized and in need of their civilization, aka colonization and oppression. This is then used to justify violence and other horrific acts towards members of the othered population, or in the case of Frankenstein, the creature that is seen as not human. No one in the novel questions whether it is okay for them to physically attack the creature. They just assume this to be justified and necessary because the creature is visibly different to them and therefore assumed by them to be less human than they are. And this is what the creature highlights in the quote I mentioned earlier, where he asks Victor why he would not consider it murder to destroy the creature. It is because Victor does not see the creature as part of his own group, not as human, but as other. Similarly, in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, we see Rocky and Frank's earlier creation Eddie relegated, especially by their creator and his servants, but partially also the likes of Janet or Columbia, to an othered, lesser position. As touched on earlier in Rocky's case, this very much takes the form of sexual objectification. His environment shamelessly gazes upon and lusts after him, but rarely addresses him directly or really considers whether he is also interested in them. They simply assume him to be so, and Rocky complies. Now, he doesn't seem to be unhappy about these sexual encounters, but I think it is safe to say that he probably lacks some information or understanding of what is happening to him, given that he was just born and has no idea what's going on. So his ability to properly consent, as I've mentioned earlier, does not seem to be a huge concern to Frank or Janet. They are fascinated and excited by the allure of a new and different sexual partner and his physical appearance, not by him as a person. Morrison describes a similar tendency in the eroticized, exoticizing portrayal of women of colour in white American literature and culture, for example with authors like Hemingway. These women are often depicted as attractive and exciting, but the relationships with them are rarely treated as serious emotional connections, the way those with white female love interests may be. The result of this objectifying treatment of Rocky is reflected in the way that the aliens seem to think it acceptable to physically harm and even kill Frank's creations. Rocky is chained to the bed in the bridal chamber he shares with Frank like an animal. Moreover, Riff Raff and Magenta taunt and whip Rocky. They let the dogs loose on him, which is incredibly dangerous, and then go and have a laugh about it. They clearly don't see Rocky as a creature of equal value. And it gets even worse. Frank kills Eddie, his first creation, without seeming to be very bothered about it, and then serves him up as a roast for dinner, removing him entirely from the sphere of humanity, or in his case, alienanity, and into the sphere of food, of an object to be consumed. In addition, Frank threatens to kill Rocky as punishment for sleeping with Janet, even though Frank himself has done the same thing. There is a very obvious double standard. The creations are expected to obey their creator and his associates, and if they don't, they are expendable. They can be simply thrown away. This does not mean that only because the characters in the text other the creations, the texts in their meta-narratives do the same thing. I don't think they necessarily do. I'm speaking here only about the in-text response to the creatures. In contrast to these, actually, Frankenstein avoids othering the creature by having him explain his story in his own highly eloquent and convincing voice. The text constructs him as a subject, even though the other characters don't. This is the reason why different readers may interpret the creature either as a monstrous villain, the way Victor and the other humans do, or as a misunderstood, mistreated individual who has chosen a horrible way to deal with his marginalization, but who is not inherently evil, as the creature presents himself, and the text allows him to present himself. There's a decent base for both of these divergent readings of the creature in the text, and this is why he is an interesting, complex, and layered character. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, on the other hand, doesn't avoid engaging in the objectification of Rocky in its own narrative in the text itself. The main characters and the narrative's perception of Rocky are relatively similar. The camera lingers on his body, makes it a spectacle that is visually engaging to look at, while he can only express himself in a very limited frame to the audience. This portrayal, even though it does show us Rocky's emotions, it shows us his fear when he's attacked by riffraff, his excitement when he beholds Janet's boobs, his grief when Frank is killed, is not a very rounded one. But because the film has such a shrill, camp, weird tone, where nothing is meant seriously, where everything is over-exaggeratedly theatrical, and this is made abundantly clear, it doesn't weigh as heavily as it might. Every character is a caricature, deliberately flat and ridiculous. Rocky is no different from the others. If anything, he's slightly less ridiculous than the others. And that's also why not only the objectification of the character, the literal silencing by making him largely nonverbal, and even the instance of dubious consent that pervades the film do not feel quite as violating as they would in a serious drama. In fact, there's a pretty serious show out there with a Frankenstein-esque subplot that borrows heavily from the Rocky Horror Picture Show, sort of visually and also when it comes to a plotline, and that shows very clearly that in a text with a different tone, the same thing can feel very, very wrong. I'm talking about American Horror Story Coven, 3rd season, and once I've managed to make myself finish it without dying from rage because of this precise storyline, I will definitely have to tear into it because what the hell is going on there? But that's definitely one for another day. Back to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, where the power imbalance simmers away under the glittering surface of the shrill and fun and colourful story, and it can easily be missed. I don't think it is one of the film's main points, but it is there nonetheless. It might be deliberate, it might not. And in the end, it doesn't really matter because what's important is what we as viewers or readers can draw from a text. It doesn't really matter, whether an author intended something if we can see it, if we can read it from the evidence we get from the text. And this example shows that in any book or film, when we look a little closer, we can find so much more than what we might have expected. To quote Frank himself, we shouldn't judge the book by its cover. And with this, like Mary Shelley, I bid my hideous progeny of a debut episode go forth and prosper. I hope this was interesting. If you enjoyed my hideous progeny, it would be great if you came back to listen to the next episode once it's out. It will be a little bit more technical on the analysis. It would be amazing if you were to come and listen to it again, and I'd be forever grateful. You can also follow this podcast's Instagram page at Midnight Culture Club for updates, visual materials to accompany the episodes, and other juicy bits. And importantly, it's where you can give me your personal feedback if you like, be it positive or negative or neutral. I'll take all of it to improve my hideous progeny. Yeah, that's it for the first ever meeting of the Midnight Culture Club. Thank you for attending, and I hope to see you again soon here on the nocturnal side. Good night and sweet dreams.